In the heat of the battle, where swords clashed and shields shattered, a warrior named Ion stood at the edge of the battlefield, his heart racing with fear and doubt. The once immense army he had been a part of was now broken, scattered across the blood-soaked earth. The enemy had gained ground quickly, overwhelming them with an intensity that no one had expected. Ion's grip on his sword tightened, but there was no denying the trembling in his hands. His comrades fought valiantly, but he couldn't help but notice the insurmountable odds they faced. As the chaos raged on, he saw men he had trained alongside falling, one after another. The cries of the wounded pierced the air, and the smell of blood hung thick around him. His thoughts began to cloud with fear, and his legs felt as though they were made of lead. The decision came in an instant, almost as if it were taken by something beyond him. He turned, his armor creaking, and began to retreat from the battlefield. The shame was immediate. The sting of cowardice seared his soul. But in that moment, all he could think about was survival, surviving so that he could fight another day. Yet, as he neared the edge of the battlefield, a cry broke through the noise. It was a cry that sent a shockwave of guilt through his very core. The sound was unmistakable, a scream of agony, followed by desperate gasps. His heart skipped a beat as he recognized the voice. It was Idris, his closest friend, and the one warrior who had always been by his side, even in the most dangerous of situations. Idris was down, surrounded by fallen enemies, struggling to move, his once strong body battered and broken. Ion's legs faltered for a moment, the weight of his retreat pressing down on him. The urge to flee was still strong, but his heart tugged him in the opposite direction. He turned back toward the battlefield, his eyes searching for Idris through the haze of smoke and dust. In the midst of the chaos, Ion found him. Idris was lying on the ground, his arm outstretched, his sword discarded a few feet away. Blood stained his armor, and his breath came in shallow gasps. Ion's chest tightened as he rushed to his friend's side, ignoring the shouts of his fellow soldiers who had seen him retreat. Their words were harsh, filled with condemnation, but Ion didn't care. The guilt of leaving Idris behind was enough to silence them. "Idris," Ion whispered, his voice shaky. He knelt beside his fallen friend, his hands trembling as he assessed the damage. Idris's leg was badly injured, the wound deep and cruel, and he was losing blood rapidly. Ion cursed under his breath, knowing that every second counted. With incredible effort, Ion pulled Idris into his arms, ignoring the protests of his aching muscles. The weight of his friend, once strong and capable, now felt like a burden too great to bear. But there was no hesitation. He had left once, and he would never allow himself to do so again. The battlefield around him seemed to fall away as Ion began to carry Idris, his steps faltering but determined. His breath was ragged as he pushed forward, every step a battle against his own fear and doubt. The enemy forces were closing in, but Ion only had one thought in his mind: save his friend. Nothing else mattered. As he made his way toward the safety of the camp, the world seemed to close in around him. His fellow soldiers, who had once hailed him as a comrade, now looked upon him with disdain. He had left them behind, and they made no attempt to hide their judgment. The murmurs of coward followed him, each word a bitter sting. But Ion pressed on, never once slowing his pace. His eyes were fixed on Idris's pale face, and the sound of his friend's labored breathing was the only thing that kept him going. There were moments when the weight of the journey seemed unbearable, when he thought he might collapse under the pressure, but the thought of Idris kept him moving. Finally, after what seemed like an eternity, Ion reached the camp. His fellow warriors rushed to assist, taking Idris from his arms and laying him down gently. They worked quickly to tend to his wounds, but Ion barely noticed them. He stood at the edge of the camp, his heart pounding, his chest tight with a mixture of relief and shame. The murmurs of his cowardice continued, and Ion could feel the eyes of his comrades boring into him. They didn't understand. They couldn't. They hadn't seen what he had seen. The look of defeat in Idris's eyes, the way his friend had fought until the very end. No, Ion hadn't run from the battle. He had run to save the life of the one person who had been his strength. It wasn't cowardice. It was sacrifice. Days passed, and Idris slowly recovered, thanks to Ion's efforts. Word spread of Ion's actions on the battlefield, the warrior who had left, only to return to rescue his fallen comrade. the whispers began to change. Some still saw him as a coward, but others recognized the truth. Ion had not been afraid to face the hardest choice of all, the choice to risk everything for someone he loved. The battle was won, but the war within Ion's heart was just beginning. He had been accused of cowardice, but in rescuing Idris, he had proven that true courage wasn't found in staying to fight when the odds were in your favor. It was found in walking away when the stakes were too high, and then coming back to save what mattered most. As the days wore on, Ion found himself increasingly isolated. His fellow soldiers still eyed him with suspicion, their whispers a constant reminder of what they had seen. The once strong bond of camaraderie had begun to fray, and Ion couldn't help but feel the weight of their judgment bearing down on him. Even the commanders, who had praised his valor in the past, now looked at him with uncertainty. He had turned his back on the battle, and the implications were deep. Despite the accusations and the sense of alienation, Ion's thoughts never strayed far from Idris. His friend's recovery was slow but steady, and Ion stayed by his side, tending to his wounds, offering words of encouragement, and quietly reassuring him that the decision had been right. Idris, for his part, never once questioned Ion's actions. His gratitude was written in every glance, every smile, and every word he spoke. It was a comfort to Ion, but it couldn't entirely silence the doubts gnawing at him. One evening, as the sun dipped low, casting a golden hue across the camp, Idris beckoned Ion to sit beside him. His voice was weak but steady, and there was a quiet strength in his gaze. "Ion, you saved my life," Idris said, his tone serious, almost too serious for a conversation that usually involved teasing or laughter. "You didn't run from the battle. You ran to save me. That is what matters." Ion remained silent for a moment, staring at the ground, unsure of how to respond. The weight of the words hung heavily in the air. "I didn't know if I could make it," Ion confessed at last, his voice raw. "The fear it consumed me. I saw the enemy closing in, and I didn't know what to do. But when I heard you, when I saw you down, I couldn't leave you behind. And yet," he trailed off, his chest tightening. "But what if I was wrong? What if I should have stayed and fought, even if it meant losing you?" Idris's hand, weak as it was, reached out to grasp Ion's arm. "Ion, the greatest warriors are not those who stand firm in the face of certain death. The greatest warriors are those who choose to protect what matters most, no matter the cost. You chose to save me. And that, my friend, is a choice that can never be called cowardice." Ion looked at Idris, and for the first time in days, he felt a flicker of peace settle in his heart. Perhaps he hadn't been wrong after all. Perhaps his decision had been guided by something deeper than fear, the desire to protect, to preserve the bond they shared, the friendship that had stood the test of so many battles. The quiet night passed slowly, and the next day brought with it a new challenge. The enemy had regrouped and was preparing to strike once more. The war wasn't over. Ion knew that this was no longer just about winning a battle or reclaiming honor. It was about redemption, not for the others, but for himself. When the call to arms rang through the camp, Ion stood tall, the weight of his sword now feeling like a promise. He wasn't just fighting for victory or for the glory of battle. He was fighting for the bond he had with Idris and for the honor of the decision he had made. He had chosen to protect his friend when it counted the most, and he would continue to fight, not for the approval of others, but for the honor of his own heart. The battle that followed was fierce, each clash of metal ringing in Ion's ears. But through it all, he fought with a newfound purpose. His strikes were decisive, his movements calculated, and his heart steady. He no longer feared the outcome, because he had already made the hardest decision. Hours later, as the sun began to rise once again, the enemy forces began to retreat. The battle was won, and Ion stood victorious, not just in the field, but within himself. He had faced his own fears, his own doubts, and had risen above them. As he returned to the camp, drenched in sweat and blood, he found Idris waiting for him, standing tall despite his injuries. The two friends locked eyes, and for a moment, the world seemed to stand still. There were no words needed between them, only the understanding that their bond was stronger than any judgment or accusation. Idris clapped Ion on the shoulder, his grin wide. "You've redeemed yourself, my friend. Not by staying, not by fighting for a victory, but by doing what mattered. You saved me, and that is the truest form of courage." Ion smiled, a deep, genuine smile. Perhaps it was the battle I needed to win all along. And so, with their friendship renewed and the battle behind them, Ion and Idris stood side by side, ready to face whatever challenges awaited them. They knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy, but together, they would face it with strength, courage, and the unbreakable bond of trust that had been forged on the blood-soaked ground of the battlefield. For Ion, the true victory wasn't in the defeat of the enemy, but in the recognition that courage isn't always about standing firm in the face of danger. Sometimes, it's about knowing when to walk away and when to return to the ones you love. The days that followed the battle brought both relief and new burdens. The enemy had retreated, but the war was far from over. Ion and Idris, though battered and bruised, felt a renewed sense of purpose. Their bond, forged in the crucible of war, was stronger than ever, but there were still many who looked at Ion with suspicion, still whispering of his cowardice. He couldn't erase the judgment of others, but he knew that their opinions no longer had the same power over him. He had faced his deepest fear and made a choice that he could live with. He had chosen to protect what mattered most to him, his friend, his brother in arms. In his heart, that was the only truth that mattered. The army regrouped, and with their strength restored, they began to prepare for the next wave of the enemy's assault. New leaders were chosen, plans were made, and strategy was discussed. Yet, amid the fervor of preparing for war, Ion found himself struggling to quiet the turmoil within. The guilt of retreating still gnawed at him, and although Idris had forgiven him, Ion wasn't sure if he could forgive himself. One evening, as the camp settled into quiet, Ion walked away from the barracks and into the cool night. The stars above were brilliant, their light offering a moment of peace amidst the chaos of war. He needed to clear his head, to find some semblance of peace before the next battle. The shadows of doubt still haunted him, threatening to drag him back into the darkness where he had once fled. It was then that Idris found him. "You're out here again," Idris said, his voice carrying the warmth of their shared history. He stepped beside Ion, looking up at the stars. "You know, you don't have to carry the weight of the world alone." Ion turned to his friend, his face grim. "I'm not sure I can stop carrying it. The things I've seen, the choices I've made, I'll never be able to shake that." Idris studied him for a long moment before speaking again. "You think I don't carry my own weight? You think I haven't questioned every battle, every choice, every life I've taken or lost? But the truth is, we can't change what's already been done. We can only decide what we do next." Ion looked away, his eyes distant. "What if I'm still not enough? What if I can't redeem myself?" Idris placed a hand on his shoulder, steady and strong. "Ion, redemption doesn't come from what others think of you. It's not about earning their respect. It's about being at peace with your own heart. It's about knowing that when the time came, you did what was right. And you did. You saved me when you didn't have to. That was your moment of redemption." Ion's heart clenched at the sincerity in Idris's voice. His friend, the one who had suffered the most in the aftermath of that battle, was now offering him something invaluable: forgiveness, not just for the past, but for the future. "I'm not perfect," Ion whispered. "I never will be. But I'll keep fighting. Not for glory, not for honor, but for the people I love. And maybe that's enough." Idris smiled, his expression softening. "It's more than enough. It's everything." The two of them stood there in silence, the weight of their words settling between them like a quiet promise. As the days passed, Ion found his resolve strengthening. He would fight, not for validation, but for something far more important. He would fight for those he cared about, for the ones who couldn't fight for themselves. And he would do it with honor, not the honor that others defined, but the honor that came from knowing he had made the right choices, even when those choices were hard. When the time came for the next battle, Ion was ready. The fear that had once paralyzed him had faded, replaced with something steadier, a quiet courage that came from within. As he took up his sword and stood alongside Idris and the other warriors, he knew that he was no longer fighting to prove himself. He was fighting for something far more sacred. The battle was fierce, but Ion fought with the same strength and determination as always. Only this time there was no hesitation. Each swing of his sword was calculated, every step forward a step toward redemption. And when the battle raged on, with enemies closing in on all sides, Ion found himself at the front lines, protecting his comrades without a second thought. When the smoke cleared and the last of the enemy had been driven back, the warriors stood victorious once again. But there was no celebration. There was only the quiet realization that the real victory was in the choices they had made in the heat of battle, the choices that defined their character, their courage, and their hearts. As Ayan and Idris walked back to camp together, their armor stained and their bodies weary, Ayan felt a sense of peace settle over him. The judgment of others still lingered in the background, but he no longer let it define him. He had done what he believed was right, and in the end, that was all that mattered. Idris clapped him on the back, grinning. "I think they'll stop calling you a coward now." Ayan laughed, though there was a hint of sadness in his voice. "Maybe, but I've stopped caring what they think." The two friends walked side by side, their footsteps echoing in the stillness of the night. Whatever battles lay ahead, they would face them together, their bond unbreakable and their courage unwavering. And for Ayan, that was enough. The weeks that followed the victory were marked by a strange quiet. The enemy had retreated far enough that there was no immediate threat, and the camp was filled with a sense of cautious optimism. Soldiers, who had long known only the tension of war, began to settle into a rhythm of routine. They repaired their armor, tended to their wounds, and tried to reclaim some semblance of peace. But for Ayan, the battle was far from over. Though the war had shifted, a battle raged within him. The guilt, the whispers of cowardice, and the doubt that had once consumed him lingered like an ever-present shadow. He had done what he believed was right, but the war within his soul was more complicated than any external conflict. He had saved Idris, and in doing so, he had found a kind of redemption. But what about the other warriors? What about the men he had left behind? Would they ever understand? Or would he forever be branded by the choice he had made? One evening, as the last traces of sunlight dipped below the horizon, Ayan found himself alone at the edge of the camp. He stood by the river, the rushing water providing a calming rhythm as he stared into its depths, trying to clear the storm inside his mind. He felt a presence beside him before he heard the footsteps. "Can't sleep?" Idris asked, his voice calm but knowing. He had seen Ayan retreat to this same spot many nights now, always alone, always lost in thought. Ayan shook his head slowly, his expression heavy. "I don't know what to feel anymore. It's like I'm still running from something. Like I haven't found peace." Idris studied him for a long moment before sitting down beside him. "You're not running, Ayan. You've already made the hardest choice of all. You decided who you wanted to be, and you've stood by it. Now you need to forgive yourself. You need to stop looking for validation from those who weren't there when it mattered. They don't understand what you did. But I do. And so does your heart." Ayan's gaze fell to the ground. He wanted to believe Idris, wanted to let the weight of those words sink in. But the truth was, he wasn't sure how to forgive himself. How could he, when so many had seen him as weak, as someone who abandoned his comrades when they needed him the most? But what about them? Ayan's voice was barely above a whisper. What about the others who fought and died? How can I live with myself knowing I ran when they kept fighting? Idris placed a hand on Ayan's shoulder, his grip steady. "You didn't abandon them. You didn't leave them to die. You chose to save me because you couldn't live with the thought of losing the one person who meant everything to you. You acted out of love, not cowardice. That's a strength, not a weakness. It's something most people can't understand." Ayan looked up, his eyes meeting Idris's, and for the first time in weeks, he felt something break inside him. A release, as though a dam had finally cracked open. The weight in his chest, the guilt, began to ease, little by little. He had always known that Idris would understand him, but hearing it spoken aloud, in such simple, unwavering terms, made him realize just how much he had been holding on to. He had been afraid of facing his own truth, but now, in the stillness of the night, with his closest friend beside him, he finally understood. "I've spent so much time looking over my shoulder, thinking I should have done things differently," Ayan said, his voice cracking. "I've been running from what happened, from what I chose." Idris smiled softly, his gaze gentle. "The hardest battles are the ones we fight inside ourselves. But running from it won't make it go away. You'll find peace when you stop trying to outrun your past." Ayan let out a long breath, the words sinking deep into him. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he could breathe. The world didn't seem so heavy anymore. Days turned into weeks, and as Ayan spent more time reflecting on his past, he began to see the bigger picture. He realized that his journey wasn't defined by one decision, one moment of fear. It wasn't the retreat that had defined him. It was the act of returning. It was the courage to do what others didn't understand, to fight for what mattered most. It was choosing love over fear, loyalty over pride, and, most importantly, choosing himself. The camp buzzed with preparations for the next phase of the war. The enemy was regrouping, and the commanders were discussing their next move. Ion knew that the peace he had found within himself didn't mean the end of the war. It only meant that he was ready to face whatever came next with a heart that no longer feared its own choices. The day arrived when the call to arms rang out once again. The army prepared to march, and Ion stood alongside Idris, both of them ready for the next battle. This time, however, the stakes felt different. Ion no longer feared the outcome because he had already found the greatest victory he could ever hope for: peace within himself. As they marched into the battlefield, Ion's eyes scanned the horizon. The enemy was waiting, but for the first time in years, Ion didn't focus on the fear of defeat. He focused on his comrades, on Idris, on the bond that had held strong through the worst of times. He was no longer fighting to prove himself. He was fighting to protect what mattered. The battle that raged before him was fierce and unrelenting, but Ion's heart remained calm. With each swing of his sword, with each step forward, he no longer saw the shadows of doubt that had once haunted him. All he saw was the present, the soldiers at his side, the mission ahead, and the knowledge that whatever happened, he had already fought his hardest battle. As the dust settled and the final blows were struck, the enemy was once again defeated. The camp erupted into cheers, but Ion stood silently at the edge of the battlefield, his hand resting on the hilt of his sword. He wasn't looking for praise. He wasn't looking for redemption. He was simply looking for peace. Idris joined him moments later, his expression unreadable, but his eyes soft. "You did it," Idris said quietly. Ion nodded, his gaze drifting across the field. "We did." In the end, it wasn't the victories that mattered most. It was the choices they made, the courage to face their fears, and the understanding that, no matter what the world said, their bond was unbreakable. And as they walked away from the battlefield, side by side, Ion knew that he had found what he had been searching for all along, not just redemption, but a life worth living. As the days passed, the army celebrated their hard-earned victory, but Ion's mind remained restless. It wasn't the roar of triumph or the banners fluttering in the breeze that held his attention. It was the quiet voice of something deeper, a feeling that lingered in the back of his mind, a pull he couldn't quite explain. Something had shifted in him during the last battle. The fear had finally been replaced by a kind of peace, yes, but there was still a gnawing curiosity, an urge to understand his place in all of this. He had saved Idris. He had fought for the ones he loved. But why did he feel like there was more to this journey, more to his purpose, than he had ever realized? Idris seemed to notice the change in him, too. He had always been the one to pull Ion out of his brooding moments. But now, there was a quiet understanding in his eyes, as if he sensed that Ion was on the verge of something new, something bigger. One evening, as the camp prepared for a brief rest before they moved on, Idris approached Ion as he stood looking out over the firelit horizon. "Ion," Idris called softly, "there's something different about you lately." Ion turned to meet his gaze. "I'm still trying to figure it out myself." "Something in you has shifted," Idris continued, his voice thoughtful. "The way you move, the way you fight, you've always had strength, but now, it's more than that. It's like you're not just fighting for survival anymore. You're fighting for something else." Ion swallowed hard, a lump forming in his throat. It was as if Idris had seen into the very heart of him, saw the questions he had been too afraid to voice. "Maybe it's time to stop running," Ion said, his voice low. "But I don't know what that means yet. I've always been driven by something, some purpose I thought I was supposed to fulfill. But now, I can't shake the feeling that there's more, that I'm meant for something beyond this." Idris raised an eyebrow, sensing that Ion was speaking of more than just battle. More than this war? Than all of this fighting? Ion nodded, feeling the weight of his own uncertainty. "I've seen men fight for glory, for power, for their own desires. And I've seen men fight for family, for honor, for the ones they love. But sometimes, I wonder if there's something greater at work. Something that connects all of us beyond the battles, beyond the bloodshed." Idris remained silent for a moment, his eyes narrowing as though considering something deeply important. Finally, he spoke. Ion, maybe you're right. Maybe we're meant for something more than what we've been taught. But whatever that is, you can't find it by searching for it in the battlefield. You can't find it through the fight alone. The word struck Ion like a lightning bolt. He had always thought of life as a series of battles to be won or lost. Yet now he realized there was something beyond those battles, something deeper, more profound. What do you mean? Ion asked, his voice thick with curiosity. Idris smiled, but it wasn't the mischievous smile Ion had grown used to. It was something softer, something more introspective. There's a path beyond the sword, beyond the violence. You've saved me. You've fought well, but perhaps the greatest battle you're meant to win is the one inside you. What if your purpose lies in the way you lead others, in the way you inspire them, not just with your sword, but with your heart? Ion's mind raced as he processed Idris's words. Lead? Inspire? Could it be true? Had all this time, all the bloodshed, all the pain, been merely a preparation for something more? Something beyond fighting? You're saying that I'm supposed to lead, but not just with strength? Ion asked, his voice uncertain but filled with the spark of something awakening within him. Idris nodded. Yes, there's strength in understanding. There's power in showing others a different way, something more than what they've known. You've faced your fears, and now, it's time to face the truth about yourself. About your heart. Ion stood in silence for a moment, the weight of those words settling over him. He had always known that there was something more, something beyond the blade, but he had been too afraid to face it. The thought of leading, of inspiring others, felt foreign, like a role he wasn't sure he was ready for. But there was something inside him, some burning conviction, that told him Idris was right. Perhaps the true purpose of his journey wasn't in the battles he fought, but in the way he lived, in the way he made others see the possibility of something greater. The next few days were filled with a new kind of tension. The army moved forward, but Ion's mind was consumed with thoughts of what Idris had said. He found himself paying more attention to the soldiers around him, not just their movements, their skill with weapons, but their hearts, their fears, their doubts, their hopes. He began to see them not as warriors, but as people. People who, like him, were caught in a cycle of violence and struggle, searching for meaning. It was during one of their routine skirmishes with the enemy that Ion's newfound clarity was truly put to the test. The battle was swift, but brutal. Ion fought with the same skill he always had, but this time, there was something different in his approach. He didn't just swing his sword. He moved with purpose, guiding his comrades with gestures and words, urging them to focus not on the enemy, but on the strength they drew from each other. He wasn't thinking about himself or his survival. He was thinking about them, about their unity. When the battle ended and the dust began to settle, Ion found himself standing beside a group of young soldiers who had been shaken by the fight. Their eyes were wide, their hands trembling with the adrenaline of combat. They were scared. Ion crouched down beside them, his voice low but steady. You did well today, not just because you fought bravely, but because you stood together. The enemy can break our bodies, but they can never break our bond, our purpose. The soldiers looked at him, their fear beginning to fade as his words sank in. For the first time, they were looking at him not just as a leader in battle, but as someone who understood what it meant to struggle, to fear, and to still rise up. In that moment, Ion realized something profound. The true power didn't lie in winning battles or earning titles. It lay in the way he could shape the hearts of others, in the way he could guide them to see that there was more to life than just survival, that there was a purpose they could find together. When the fight was over, and the soldiers gathered around their campfire that night, Ion knew that his journey had only just begun. He wasn't just a warrior anymore. He was a leader, not because he held a sword, but because he could show others the strength of their hearts. And as the campfire crackled and the stars glittered above, Ion felt a sense of peace that went beyond battle. He had found his true purpose, not in the war, but in the way he could help others fight the war within themselves. The true test, he knew, was not in the next battle, but in the way he would lead his brothers through the challenges of life. The war wasn't over, but Ion's heart had finally found the peace it had been searching for all along.